Welcome to the Friendly City Books podcast. My name is Emily, and I'm the owner and founder of Friendly City Books. And today I'm really excited to be joined by author Nyani Nkrumah.
It's a delight to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. So Nyani is going to be coming to visit us here in Mississippi. Starting today, we are going on a book tour around the entire state. I hope you're ready for this. It is going to be quite the road trip. We are going to start here in Columbus. We're kicking it off today. Then we're going to Square Books in Oxford on Tuesday, Storybooks in Cleveland on Wednesday, Lemuria Books in Jackson on Thursday. On Friday, we're going to drive down to the coast. And then on Saturday, we are going to have our last event at Pass Books in Pass Christian. And we are doing this for Nyani's debut novel, Wade in the Water. So I want to make sure to hold up the book cover for those who are watching on YouTube, because it's a very pretty color scheme. In fact, it matches our bookstore. And I have really, really enjoyed reading this book.
Great. Glad to hear it.
So I would like to share Nyani's background and bio before we get into the discussion. Nyani was born in Boston and raised in Ghana and Zimbabwe. She developed her love of reading and writing from her mother, who taught English literature and language and encouraged her children to recite poems and Shakespeare soliloquies. After graduating from Amherst College with a dual major in biology and Black studies, Nkrumah received a master's degree from the University of Michigan and a Ph.D. from Cornell University. She has lived in the Washington, D.C. region for the past 20 years. So I would love to hear more about your childhood. As a little girl growing up in Mississippi, it was always my dream to travel abroad. And I didn't get to do that until I was an adult. But can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing?
Sure. I had quite an interesting background. As you know, I was born in Boston, left shortly after. My parents moved to Ghana, West Africa, where they're from. And I grew up there till the age of 15. Now, it was a very amazing childhood, I would say. It was a childhood filled with, a lot of outdoor playing, kind of like you would maybe in Mississippi in the 70s and 80s. And then when I was 15, my parents moved to Zimbabwe, which is in Southern Africa. And the contrast between those two countries was very, very stark. One was obviously a rich, warm community. The second place was just going through independence and a transition from former white rule to African rule. So being in those two contexts was very interesting growing up for me. And then, of course, I came back to the U.S. and have been pretty much in the U.S., ever since for the last 30-something years.
Okay.
Yeah, but I do travel a lot frequently.
Yes. So I believe your job probably sends you all over the world. We were just talking before the recording started about how Nyani works at the World Bank. So how did that happen? What led you there?
For some reason, I always wanted to work for the World Bank because I was very interested and passionate about development. And I met someone when I was in my sophomore year at college, and he was an environmental specialist. And I met him and I said, I want to be just like him. And actually, that is exactly what I decided to do. And that somehow, miraculously, I have followed that path. I'm a natural resource specialist / environmental specialist at the World Bank. And I spent my life, I call myself a tree hugger. So I'm very into climate change, nature, beauty. That's one of my passions. And then, of course, my other passion is literature and books.
Yes. So when did you start working on this book? When did the idea first arrive?
I would say, in terms of writing, I probably wrote my first kind of little novel, not novel, maybe 10 pages when I was about 12. And then when I was 19, I wrote a 48-page children's novel. So I've always been interested in looking at things through children's eyes. And that got published and sold. It was just a little, 48 page. It wasn't quite a book. So the idea and the desire to be a writer has always been with me. So I would say maybe about 7 years ago, I started this journey. I decided I was going to definitely write a book. I was part of a book club. And book clubs are amazing because, you're reading a book. We read every month. And I think that just puts you in the mood. You're reading other people's work, you're criticizing it, you're enjoying it. And that just made me want to write. So 6 or 7 years ago, thereabouts, I just started putting pen to paper, and I was very busy. So I just did it a little bit at a time, a paragraph at a time. And then I took some time off work now and then to concentrate on writings.
Oh, wow. Well, hearing you say that, you worked on this, and as small bites as a paragraph at a time,
Yeah.
I actually feel that in the writing because each paragraph and each line is very well considered. Like the language choices, the word choices. One reason why I enjoyed reading the book so much, the characters are great and the plot is very compelling, but the language is also it's pleasing to kind of like hear in your head as you're reading it. And it's almost poetic in that way. And maybe it's because if you're doing it a paragraph at a time, you're really thinking about every word that's going in that paragraph.
I literally am thinking of every word. And actually, to write one chapter may take 4 or 5 months because I'm going back over and over each paragraph. And I'm saying to myself, how does it sound? Is it lyrical? Am I getting across the emotion of the character? How am I feeling about the character? What do I want to convey? Her feeling sad or happy, and even just the pacing of the language. For me, that was very important in how I told the story. So it wasn't really just about the story. It was really focusing on how I told the story because I felt that was really important for the reader to be drawn into the story and really understand these two characters, Catherine and Ella. And I wanted them in their heads, And so it was really important how I actually constructed the story.
Yeah. And did you start with one character in mind first, or did they come at the same time?
No, I started with Ella. Ella was my main character. She's a 12-year-old African-American in this story. And she is the one I started. I had her in my head from the beginning. I knew she was going to be sassy. I knew she was going to be resilient. Some people say to me, well, Ella is nice and resilient, but that she just has this little spice
She does.
about her. And I think that's very compelling. They find her sweet, they find her spicy. And she's always been the main character in my head. She's the main narrator. And then after a while, Catherine came along, and I also started to develop Catherine because she's the other voice in the story. And she's also a very compelling voice. And to try to get her right was something that I worked hard on.
Yes. In fact, let's talk a little bit more about the two characters because I do think they each deserve a little time in this discussion. And let's start with Ella because Ella is so sweet. And Ella reminds me a lot of Matilda, who is one of my favorite characters in children's literature. Because I remember, in that story of Matilda, she was wise beyond her years. I mean, she was precocious and intelligent and bubbly, but she also came from a home environment where she wasn't appreciated. But I think where this goes even further than the Matilda story, it's frankly quite sad, but I think it's also more realistic and more honest, is that Ella comes from an abusive household.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
that is true.
It was hard to read sometimes, the things that she was living through, especially at that age. But I know that the truth is that there are children still today who live in these circumstances.
Yeah, definitely. It is a story about really what she went through, like her parents and who they are. And also, I mean, I go into why the parents are the way they are. And you kind of find that it's partly due to Ella's birth position, partly due to, the history of abuse in the family, and what has happened down the line in generations and people's thoughts and perceptions about Ella. And so that makes for a story of a child that is looking for love. And that's one of the key things about Ella. She's looking for love all over. And she does, when Catherine St. James comes into the picture, slowly their relationship evolves, and Ella is indeed looking for that mother figure.
Yes. And I think it's not a spoiler to explain to our audience that so Ella was born out of wedlock, out of an affair that her mother had. And Ella has an older sister who is kind of the prize of the family. She's got an older brother who is very smart. And so, they also have a lot of expectations riding on him. And then she's got a younger brother. And she is kind of the black sheep, sort of. Right. And the family is just very begrudging to even include her in the family.
Yeah.
So when you describe her as looking for love, I think that's really the perfect way to describe her. She's a child who just has not been validated.
Yeah.
And has a lot to offer and has a lot of love to give, and is looking for someone to receive it and give it back to her.
Yeah. And that idea actually for Ella came from a real situation that I knew, of a child that was the result of an affair that became part of the rest of the family and was not well treated. So as you say, it does happen. And that was my initial idea for Ella. It came from a true story.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing that, with literature is sometimes it helps us connect with, difficult circumstances that we may have gone through or someone we know may have gone through. And so I hope that if there are, people out there who know of someone like Ella, that they can see themselves reflected in the book. And then we go to Catherine, who you mentioned as the other main character. And Catherine has a very interesting backstory, but she swoops into this town as kind of this new, so let me, for people who aren't from Mississippi, when someone who is not from Mississippi comes to town, it is a big deal. People talk about it. And I am guilty of this myself. When people come into the bookstore and they are not from Columbus, we interrogate them about who they are, where they're from, why they're in Columbus, what they're doing there, how long they're going to be there. So imagine, this woman who has, no apparent relationship, no family in this small town of Ricksville, this fictional town where everything takes place. She just shows up one day, a woman who's maybe about my age, probably in the book, and rents a house on the black side of town. And everyone is like, what is going on?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how did you develop Catherine?
Well, Catherine's story, I would say plain imagination. What if, what if this white woman walks into this close-knit society? And you see the converse a lot in other books. So, for example, another Mississippi writer, if you look at The Help, when you're looking at the interracial relations and characters, you do find a lot of, white children and Black mother figures. And this time I decided, for me, it was very interesting. I was like, well, what would happen if a white woman just came out of nowhere? Obviously, there is a backstory and what she's about. What if she shows up, and how does the community react? And that is the whole context of the community and their relationship with Catherine, and how that develops. I don't want to, I don't want to spoil anything, but just to say it sets off a lot of dynamics. It sets off, as you say, a lot of gossip, a lot of people wondering what she's doing there. Is she from the government? What is she coming to do? And why is she there? And then people look at her a lot without saying anything directly to her. So all these things are going on around her. And a lot of this is conveyed to the reader by Ella, because Ella is noticing what's happening in the community. So it sets up an interesting dynamic.
Yes, and for all they know, she is, she's from the North. They have no idea that she actually grew up in Mississippi herself. And I think that we can safely say this, even if you haven't read the book, because early on in the book, there's kind of this parallel story development going on between Ella's life and Catherine's flashbacks to her childhood. Mm-hmm. And Catherine is from Mississippi. And one important point to anchor to as we talk about the book is that it's set near Philadelphia, Mississippi. And Philadelphia was where 3 civil rights workers were murdered by white supremacists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodwin, and Michael Schormer. And that plays an important role in this book. I mean, it's kind of a touchstone in the book mm-hmm. that all of the events ultimately circle around. So can you talk about what led you to want to approach that historic event?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, coming from Mississippi, it's a pivotal point in the civil rights movement. It led to so much happening afterwards, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And how I came across it, I was just actually in Nashville, Tennessee, at one of the museums. And the picture of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner was, it's that famous photograph that you see probably in every single magazine, which is a picture of the FBI probably put out looking for the 3 men. And I've seen it tons of times. I've seen it so many times. And I didn't really sit and stare at the picture. But this particular moment, I looked at the picture and I said, wait a minute, this is 1964. You have 1 black man and 2 white men killed. And obviously they all work. I know, obviously they were all working together for CORE. As part of the Freedom Summer movement. And the relationship and the dynamics of the 3 of them, an interracial group working on one particular thing, the civil rights movement and the progression of civil rights in America. I mean, it struck me, you don't often see pictures, particularly in that era, of people working together like that. And then when you go into the history of what the Freedom Summer movement was all about and the university students that all came to do work in Mississippi, then of course you get the context. But then I was like, this is really where I want to anchor the story, because it's really pivotal when you talk about interracial relations. You can talk about, all the history that has happened. You can talk about all the bad things that have happened. But on the hopeful side, you can look and see the story of this civil rights progression and the voices and the people that actually, laid down their lives for this cause. And so I really wanted to anchor it. And when I used that, I was probably more than halfway through the book when I went to this museum in Mississippi. And just looking at that picture was like an aha moment. And it drew everything together because then I had this focus point of where I wanted the story to end up and where I wanted people to see hope within the story as well.
Yeah. And, the hopefulness in it, I recently had a conversation with my family because I had been interviewed by Rooted magazine. So Lauren Rhodes, who is going to be our moderator for our book tour events, is the editor of a new online website called Rooted Magazine that interviews Mississippians about what it means to be a Mississippian, because it involves a lot of tangled up emotions. And as I was talking to my family about the interview I did, one thing I heard a lot was, well, can we acknowledge how far we have come? Mm-hmm. And we have definitely made some progress, but it's also important not just to acknowledge how far we come, but where we were. Yeah. And, your novel really brings to life what it would have looked like in the 1960s to be inside the mind of someone who could do such a heinous act. And it reminded me of this Eudora Welty short story that she wrote following the assassination of Medgar Evers called Where is the Voice Coming From? Where she goes inside the head of Byron De La Beckwith, who assassinated Medgar Evers. How did you put yourself in the right mind space yourself to be able to take on the point of view of a character who is hard to sympathize with?
Yeah, I did. That was a lot of research that I did. I mean, there are some novels out there. 3 Lives for Mississippi is one of them. There are also some books which really interview people in the 1960s, both Black and white people, about what went on. And they were very frank about their thoughts and their sentiments. So I would say a lot of research, some videos of that era, just to get in the right headspace and the right mind frame. Of course, some of it is imagination, but I wanted it based on actual historical truth. So some of the words you hear are actually people's words that they're saying. Some of it is obviously through the events that happened, the Freedom Summer movement. I visited a church in Mississippi, actually near Philadelphia. And that's the same church that was burnt in 1964. And I visited them, and they did do a commemoration. That's the Mount Zion Methodist Church. It's called Historic Mount Zion. And every year they do a commemoration of these 3 civil rights workers. And what they do have also is a book, a kind of booklet, which gives you detailed, you can't get that in a history book, or maybe you can get it in the archives. But it's a detailed interview with some of the church people during that time when the church was burnt and what they felt. And that gave me an additional source of information as well. So all of these things, I put together to get into what I think are the hearts and minds of people at the time. Some of it is, is also imagination. So a lot of the arguments about the farmer and why the farmer needed people to work on the farm. Some of that is based, obviously, in history, and some of it is also my own imagination. So.
Yeah, no, so one thing that really struck me, that was almost a little bit hard to swallow, is Catherine's character she appears sympathetic to the civil rights movement, but she also grew up in a home environment that promoted white supremacist ideals. And she is in a college class where she has to write an essay, and the class is literally about race. Right. She signed up for it knowing that this is what the class would be about. And she keeps playing devil's advocate. And you almost wonder, is she playing devil's advocate just for the sport of it, or does she really believe these things? And it reminded me of, honestly, when I was a child, the textbook that I had for Mississippi studies in elementary school told us that the main reason behind the Civil War was that the South wanted to have state banks and the North wanted to have a national bank. And me, like Ella, like an impressionable young 12-year-old girl, thought, well, if a book says it, it must be true, because this is the book they gave to us in school, and the books they give to us in school tell the truth.
Right.
So, Catherine has been spoon-fed a very revisionist history of why things are the way that they are. And she is still clinging to that when she is tested, and when she is presented with evidence to the contrary. Mm-hmm. And so those parts of the book where she is, where she and her professor are debating, sometimes you think, oh, maybe she is having a healthy debate over this. Maybe maybe her professor is getting her to think a little bit more critically about it. Mm-hmm. But then I would come away sometimes thinking, I don't know if she really is, taking a step forward, because it seems like she's still holding on to this.
Yeah. And that's exactly how I wanted the reader to feel, because in the book, we have no idea what's going on in Catherine's mind or where she's, coming from. And definitely you can see Catherine has trauma in her life from her past, and she is, working to overcome this trauma. So this lively debate in the university setting, in my university setting, you would probably have those same type of debates. It's just when you go further in the book, you begin to say, well, is this really a healthy debate? What is actually going on in Catherine's mind? So yeah, but you are definitely right. You're not quite sure at the point in which you read that.
Yes. And she's trying to make this point that, well, white people were hurt too, because, as Black people gained rights, she saw it as a zero-sum game, that I'm having to lose something for other people to make gains, which I hate. This is the framing, unfortunately. I wish that this weren't, her thought process, but this is the thought that some people do have. And she's making this economic argument. And, I have often thought about, Mississippi was the richest state in the country around the time it became a state.
Yeah.
And that was entirely due to having a labor force that was exploited.
Right.
And I don't know if we have ever been able to make sense of that and figure out how to build an economy that isn't built on the backs of other people. And I wonder if that is why, our state has, it has the lowest household income today. And, we don't have, there aren't any Fortune 500 companies based in Mississippi. It's still a largely agrarian and natural resources heavy economy. And, I'm curious, since you do work in this area professionally, what do you think it takes for economies to turn the corner and be more sustainable?
Well, since I'm not an economist, I probably wouldn't talk for the economists, but I would say, just from my, my own knowledge, which hopefully is right, I would just probably say, you need investment in the infrastructure. The government needs to put in the infrastructures that would attract businesses. There needs to be capital. And of course, there needs to be an educated labor force and maybe tax breaks that would attract people into a place that is, that maybe nobody thinks of at the moment. But I'm not an economist, so I wish I were.
I couldn't help but ask because I did used to work in public policy and think about these issues.
Right.
Because I just think it's hard for the state to move forward with that legacy until we really unravel it and understand it better. And I think, your book is going to revoke a lot of questions about, have we really come to terms with the things that happened? Your book is set. It's interesting how you are shifting the perspective from an event that happened in 1964 to 20 years later, approximately in 1982. That's a really interesting place to sit and look at the history, as opposed to being right there in it while it's happening, or looking at it from today all the way back. And the 1980s were an interesting time in Mississippi. And I'm just going to take this opportunity to go on a little detour here, because in the 1980s, Mississippi was actually really moving forward in a lot of ways. Mississippi had some state leaders who were really innovative. And a lot of people speak very highly today of the governor at that time, William Winter. I want to say he would have been governor, but I'll have to go back and double check. But it was during the 80s, and he was known as the education governor. Education was his number one issue. And while he was in office, he made kindergarten universal. It had not been at that point. And he started the high school that I ultimately attended, called the Mississippi School for Math and Science, which is a magnet school for 11th and 12th graders from all over the state, to bring them in. And I think it's been one of the most important investments that's ever happened in the state of Mississippi, because for 30 years we've had this center of innovation that draws, the human capital, talented Mississippians together and changes the trajectory of their lives. And then he also started this program called Governor's School, the Mississippi Governor's School, which I've been involved in for several years. I attended when I was in high school. I've gone back and taught since as an adult to current high school students. And it's another program that he put in place that was to to bring talented people together who might not encounter each other otherwise, and give them new opportunities. So a lot was actually happening in the 80s that looked like Mississippi was really going to move forward. And so it's a bit frustrating from where I sit now to see what could have been. And I mean, of course, there's still, that just means it's up to us, right? It's up to me and up to the people who are here now to take the torch. Governor Winter actually passed away about 2 years ago. But it was a big deal. He was still beloved in the state of Mississippi. So I also can't help but think what he would have thought of your book. I'll have to see if maybe we'll get a chance to visit with some of the family when you're here.
Sure. Well, I set it in 82. And the reason I did that was I didn't want to sit in the past. I wanted to look back into the past and move forward. So obviously 20 years later, a lot has happened, a lot has changed. And yet a lot probably remains the same. So I wanted the community to be able to have this, knowledge. And of course, some of the people in the community are old enough to have grown up in the 1960s. So they do remember, the 1960s and everything that happened with the civil rights movement. Yet the children are just coming up. So they've read it in history books, but they don't, as I say in the book, they don't really feel it. And I wanted to set aside to compare these two contrasting generations where you have the younger children who are a lot more open to Catherine St. James' arrival, And then the older, members of the community who are a lot more, suspicious and careful about what she's doing in the community. And I wanted to set that up, showing that with the passage of time, things change and perspectives change from generation to generation, but not to leave the past behind because it follows us, and to know what to do with it as we move forward. So that's why I set up the book the way it is. I think it's an interesting exercise for people to look at today. If you look in the 2020s, especially these last 3 years, and see how far we've come, and how much more work there is to do.
We have so many fun things happening at Friendly City Books. Make sure you never miss an event or sale by signing up for our email newsletter at friendlycitybooks.com.
All right, so we had a little break right there, but I just wanted to share just a little bit more of just kind of the state history that I was thinking about as I was reading the book, Wade in the Water. And I was thinking about what it meant in my hometown, because while I knew about the murders of the 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, I was innocent and ignorant of the fact that there were others that were not as prominent that had happened, and that those were not an isolated incident. They were, just the most prominent.
Yeah.
And so in my town, I learned just a few years ago that the story of, and actually I heard this story from a Princeton professor to tie into the book that has the Princeton University connection, Eddie Glaude, who has written a few books and is on television. He was telling the story of his mentor, Alan Raboteau, who is from the town I grew up in, Bay St. Louis. And his father we believe, was murdered. And it was one of those cases where a group of white men came to the door and his mother answered, and she was pregnant with him at the time. And they asked, "Where's your husband?" And she never saw him again. And there are lots of stories like this. And in some ways, the more prominent stories, like the one in Philadelphia or Emmett Till, have been loomed so large in our minds that we haven't excavated our own skeletons that may be in our own communities. And, so I was thinking about all of this when I thought about your fictional town of Ricksville and Wade in the Water, because, in this community, and you mentioned, so it's 20 years after the events of, the early 60s. And the community has, on the surface level, seemed to have moved on. There's still segregation in kind of like cultural terms, as opposed to like legal segregation. There's still a street that divides the black neighborhood from the white neighborhood. But the town has tried to move on without really dwelling on what has happened and reckoning with it and coming to terms with it. And the one other story that it made me think of from my hometown is, so my mother was probably in about kindergarten when schools were integrated. And when I was growing up, I remember the police station in my hometown looked like a school. It had a long row of classrooms, and it had a gym, and it had a cafeteria. And we used to sometimes go to the gym for theater practice or volleyball games. And one day I asked my mom, "Isn't it weird that the police station looks like a school?" And she said, "It used to be the black school." I said, "Well, no one's ever told me that. There's no sign there's no historical marker that says this. How am I supposed to just know? I wasn't around at that time. So, I think it goes to show the importance of making sure that this information is passed down.
Yeah.
And you mentioned referencing, the oral history of the church that had been burned down, and the importance of preserving those stories so that we can go back and look at them and see what happens.
Yeah, very, very important. That was, as I said, the most important information that I got. But also your reference to, it wasn't just the three civil rights workers. It wasn't just James Chaney, Mike Schwerner, and Andy Goodman. And part of that is resonated in the book, in the part of the book which is probably the most surprising. I'm not going to share what it is, but that is where I drew that chapter from, that surprising element. But you're right. It's pieces of hidden history that don't come to light, but they are locked up somewhere. If you go through old newspaper records, but they don't make it to, mainstream media, but they are there, those hidden truths that I think are important to look at, particularly if you're moving forward. You need to, I believe, examine the past and see, the impact. And a lot of this book is about legacy. How does that not just affect past generations, but the generations moving forward? And that's why I'm very excited that you will be giving out free books to students, which is really amazing.
Yes.
Yes. So that is very impactful. To revisit the history through modern eyes, and I'm hoping that this book will be very thought-provoking. It more or less will force you to do some self-reflection on both sides of both communities, to do some reflection.
Yeah, I know there's so much more that we could say, but I should probably save some of it for the book tour, especially if we lose an internet connection again. But I do, just to reiterate and reemphasize what Nyani shared, we are going to have free copies of the book Wade in the Water for students who come to our book tour events. So high school students, college students, graduate students, non-traditional students, we just want to make sure that we can get copies of this book into more hands, because I think it's going to lead to a lot of really important conversations. So again, the book tour starts tonight in Columbus at Friendly City Books at 5:30 p.m. Then we are going to Square Books on Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. in Oxford. Then we are going to Cleveland on Wednesday. We will be at Storybooks at 6 p.m. On Thursday, we are going to Lemuria and Jackson at 5 p.m. And then we're going to wrap up on Saturday at Pass Books on the coast at 12 p.m. So if you can make it to one of those events, we would love to see you there. We would love for you to invite your friends and your family and any students that you know who might want to take advantage of the free book. And you can also purchase copies of the book as well at these events. You can also go to friendlycitybooks.com. We will make sure to get extra signed copies after the book tour that we can distribute if you'd like to get a signed copy. So, Nyani, we can't wait for you to come to Mississippi. Are you ready?
So excited to come back. Really excited. And to hear, people's questions, comments. Very excited to interact with your readers.
Well, we can't wait. So, we are going to keep talking about this book all week long. And for those of you who are listening, go ahead, pick up a copy so that you can read along as well. And thank you for joining us, Nyani. Thank you to our audience, and happy reading.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.